We are on Daf Ayin Aleph Amid Beis. Today's Daf is Daf Ayin Beis, and we began seeing the Gemara's explanation of Rabbi Elazar Todai, the second explanation, which Rabbi Yosef says that the reasoning that Rabbi Yosef Todai says when there are partnerships of wine between multiple entities here, between the various neighbors, that each one needs an Eruv. And we said that the basis for this is whether you can rely on a shituf muvos, a partnership in the alleyway, in place of an Eruv for the courtyard. There are two ways or times that somebody would want to make an Eruv. All the houses in the courtyard want to be able to carry from the courtyard to the house and vice versa, and to each other. And so they make an Eruv. This is an Eruv Chatzeros, a courtyard Eruv. Then there's Shitufei Mavoyis, partnership in the alleyway, where all the houses in the alleyway want to be able to carry to each other, and all the courtyards in the alleyway want to carry to each other, or to from the alleyway to the courtyard. That's called Shitufei Mavoyis. What Rabbi Elazar Todai is saying is that you cannot have you cannot rely on the partnership in the alleyway, on the shituf muvois, as the basis for your carrying from the house to the chutzner. You would need separately an eruv in your courtyard so that you can carry from the courtyard to the house and vice versa, and then also have an eruv in the alleyway.
What's the point of having a shitufei mavois if you can't carry from your chutzner? There's no way to get to the mavoy. There's nowhere to carry in the mavoy without carrying in your chutzner.
No, you can carry from the courtyard to your alleyway, from the chutzner to the mavoy, but you cannot carry from your house to the chutzner.
If you didn't do an eruv chatzeros
and you made a shitufei mavois, you can carry from the alley, from the mavoy to the chutzner, to the courtyard, and vice versa, but not from the house to the courtyard and the courtyard to the house.
So you can't get something from the mavoy to your house. If you
could get into the courtyard.
Huh?
Into the courtyard.
But you can't carry. You could carry in the courtyard.
You can carry into the courtyard from the alleyway and vice versa, just not into your house.
They could walk around the courtyard with whatever you were carrying in the mavoy, but you couldn't take it into your house.
Correct. So that's what Rabbi Elazar Todai says. You cannot rely on that, and you'd have to have a separate eruv for your courtyard. Now, this is really the opinion of Rabbi Meir, which we're about to see. And as we saw yesterday, that Rav said that the halacha is like Rabbi Meir, and the halacha is like Rabbi Elazar Todai. And the Gemara said the reason for this is because Rabbi Meir is a double stringency on the Chachamim, 2 layers of that chumrah. So we'll get back to that in a moment. Let's first see what is the machlokas of Rabbi Meir, which will tell us this this concept and of the double chumrah. And this is based upon the idea that we had, and we talked about a number of times, that for the eruv of the chutzner, eruv chatzeres, for your courtyard eruv, you need to have a bread. Because what you're doing is you're extending the living space, the house, into the courtyard and making it one home and one entity of a home. So therefore, you need bread, a living food, a food that you would have in your dwelling place. Whereas for the shitufei mavois, for the alleyway, your partnership is really in anything that you would have in the courtyard, anything that you would have in storage, and therefore wine, oil, fruit can also be used for your alleyway partnership for shitufei mavois, and but that wouldn't be valid for your eruv in your courtyard, your eruv chatzeros. So here we have two layers of when we can say that the eruv that you used for your alleyway, meaning the shitufei mavois, would not be valid as your eruv for your courtyard, and you need a separate eruv for your courtyard. Level 1 is obviously the opinion that of the Chachamim, which is that you could have your shitufei mavois, your alleyway partnership count as your eruv. Once you've made an alleyway partnership that all members of the alleyway, meaning all of the courtyards and all of the members of the courtyards, joined in to your eruv, which is called shitufei mavois, the partnership of the alleyway, even if it's made of wine, that is, since you now have a valid partnership and a valid eruv in your alleyway, that includes your alleyway, it includes your courtyards, and includes the homes, and it's all going to be considered kosher eruv, even though that the wine itself could not be used as an eruv for your courtyard. But since you used it for where it is valid in the alleyway, and the alleyway included all the courtyards and all the houses that are in it, so therefore it's a valid eruv for everything, and you don't need a separate eruv in each courtyard. That's the leniency of the Chachamim. The layer above that is Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai, who says, no, for wine, that's not going to be valid. But if you made a partnership with bread in the alleyway, the shitufei mavois was made with bread, and bread could be used as an eruv for your courtyard, that would be valid, and you could rely on that as well. You wouldn't need a separate eruv for each courtyard. It would be sufficient to rely on the alleyway. However, Rabbi Meir says even that is not valid. And you would not have a valid eruv if you just had a partnership of bread in your alleyway. Besides for the alleyway partnership, the shitufei mavois, you would also need a ruvei chatzeros, a partnership, a eruv, a joint meal in each courtyard separately. And so therefore, Rabbi Meir is going to be a double chumrah on the Chachamim. One, that he invalidates wine, and two, even bread would be invalid. So that's why Rav said the halach is like Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai. That's one chumrah, and like Rabbi Meir, another chumrah. Now let's see this opinion of Rabbi Meir. My Rabbi Meir, my Rabbanan. What is this Rabbi Meir and Rabbanan? The Tani we learned. Ma'arvim b'chatzeros b'pas. An eruv in a courtyard must be done with bread, as we explained, because you're creating a home, and so it has to have home food and basically functional food. If you try to make an eruv in your courtyard with wine, that won't work because it's not a staple. For a partnership in the alleyway, you can make it biyayin, and as Tesis brings from the Gemara later, you can also use barrels of oil, as we saw in the previous Mishnah, dates, figs, all types of fruit. It doesn't have to be bread, which is your staple. It can be any type of food as a valid eruv for the partnership of the alleyway, which is shitufei mavois. Of course, if you wanted to do it with bread in the alleyway, that also would work. Now, the Brisa continues and says, you would need both an eruv for your courtyard individually. You don't have to make an eruv with all the courtyards combined, but you'd need one for your courtyard, which allows the 5 homes in your courtyard to carry together. And then and besides for that, you'd need a partnership in the mavoi in the alleyway. Why do we need both? Because children don't forget the concept of eruv for the courtyards. Because they'll say, my parents never made an eruv, never made a bread eruv. So over here, it seems this idea of that the next generation remember the halachas of eruv is for the courtyard. That you need a courtyard eruv so that the children will know that even though that there's an alleyway eruv, a courtyard eruv is there as well. Earlier in the Masechta, we saw Rashi said that the whole concept of food in your alleyway or your courtyard is only a reminder of a traveler's eruv techumin. Either way, but Rabbi Meir says you require both. Besides for the alleyway eruv, you're also going to need the courtyard eruv. Divri Rabbi Meir, that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim say either is good. Either you make an eruv, or you're going to make a which is the courtyard, or a shitufei mavois, or a partnership in the alleyway, and that would suffice for the courtyards as well. Meaning that the Chachamim are going to say that as long as you made a valid eruv in the alleyway, whether it's wine, whether it's bread, which could be used for your courtyard, or even if it's wine, which cannot be used for your courtyard, but since it's valid for the alleyway, and the alleyway includes all the homes and courtyards that are in the alleyway, therefore that would be valid, even though that the wine itself could not be used for any individual courtyard. So now there's a machloikas pligi bar of nechuni v'rabba. This is the version we have in the Gemara. Everybody agrees. Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim would agree that with bread, it's sufficient to make an eruv in the alleyway, and that would work also for the courtyards. Keep ligis. The machlokes is only biyayin that the Chachamim say even if you use wine as your eruv for the alleyway, which would not be valid for your courtyard. Nevertheless, since it's valid in the alleyway, it would work. It would cover and encompass the courtyard. Now we're on Ayin Beis Amud Aleph. Everybody agrees if you made an eruv with wine in the alleyway, shitufim avois, that would require you to make a separate eruv for your courtyard. Keep pligi pass, and the machlok is only by bread, where the Chachamim say bread would count in the alleyway since it's valid for the courtyard. It would count for the courtyard. The Chachamim say, and Rabbi Meir says no, you need a separate eruv for the alleyway and a separate eruv for the courtyard. And therefore, going back to the previous Gemara, when the Rav said that Allah is like Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai and Rabbi Meir, he's going in Rabbi Meir in the strictest version, that Rabbi Meir says even if you used bread, it would not be a valid eruv. And Rabbi Elazar, and that's telling us that Rabbi Elazar, since he said that Allah is like Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai and Rabbi Meir, it tells us that both of these steps, it's not valid if you used wine, and it's not valid even if you used bread. According to Rabbi Meir, you would need a separate eruv for your alleyway, for your courtyard, besides for the eruv of the alleyway. So we're going to try and prove this, or whether the Chachamim disagree only about wine, or the Chachamim disagree about bread. That Rabbi Meir says even if you use bread, you cannot make. You need a separate. It would not cover your courtyard. You need a separate courtyard. So we challenge. They say a general rule. You need either an eruv or a partnership in the alleyway. Now, my love, wouldn't you say that you would make an eruv in the courtyard, which would be bepas with bread, or make a partnership in the alleyway, and that is even if it's with wine, because that, since they said a general rule that you could just make an eruv in the alleyway, and alleyways valid with wine, so that would be even with wine. So the Gemara says no. What they mean is you could use, if you're using bread, you can use either the alleyway, either the courtyard, and that would be valid. And that would be valid not only for the courtyard, but also for the alleyway. If everybody made a bread eruv, so then all the courtyards together, so that would include the alleyway. Or you can make a partnership with bread in the alleyway, and that would cover the courtyards. So it goes both ways. That if you have everybody participate in make an eruv for the courtyards, that would also cover the alleyway. Not just the version we were going up until now, that if you made an eruv in the alleyway, it will cover the courtyard. But also, if everyone in the alleyway made an eruv in their courtyards, it would also cover the alleyway. But it all has to be with bread, according to this version. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, halacha Rabbi Meir. Rav Yehuda Amar Rav said that we rule in public. This is the ruling that we give everyone. The halacha is like Rabbi Meir. You make an eruv in the alleyway and an eruv in the courtyard. However, Rav Huna Amar Mina Rabbi Meir. No, that's not the ruling. It's just the custom. And so if people ask, we tell them to do that, but it's valid even if they didn't do that. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Nagam Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yochanan says, actually, it's just that the people had that custom. It's not even a minute. Meaning, if they did so, it's going to be valid, obviously, but that's not the ruling, we would tell people.
What's the difference between Rav Huna and Rabbi Yehuda?
If people ask, do we tell them that? It's not a public ruling. We wouldn't announce it in the shul. We wouldn't announce it at the teachings at the shiurim. But if somebody asks, we would tell them. Or no, we don't even tell them that. But if they did it, that's going to be obviously okay.
What is it? What's the difference between saying minhag can Rabbi Meir or nagu can Rabbi Meir?
Do we rule that way in private question that someone asks us? Do we tell them, yeah, that's what the right thing to do? Do we tell them that's the 1 second? Then we tell them that's the right thing to do, or if they did so, it's going to be valid.
Rabbi Yehuda says
if they come and ask, we don't tell them to do that.
Rabbi Yehuda says halacha can Rabbi Meir. Period.
That means a public. That's what we give when you teach in the academy, when the yeshivas are taught, when there's a halacha shiur, you say that's the halacha. That's the first level. The second level says, no, we don't make a public announcement like that. But if privately somebody asks, we'll tell them that's the right thing to do. Third version, no, we don't even tell them.
Why didn't he say that? Rav Huna just says minhag to Rabbi Meir. What's the difference with Rabbi Meir? What's the difference between Rav Huna and Rabbi Yochanan?
I'm telling you.
I know, but you're saying it, but it doesn't say that. I mean, how do we touch it that that's what it means?
Sorry?
Rav Yehuda is straightforward, right? Rav Huna doesn't go that far to say halacha ka Rabbi Meir. He says minhag ka Rabbi Meir.
That means that we don't rule that way in the public, but privately, if someone asks, that's what we tell them to do.
How do we know that that's what that minhag ka Rabbi Meir means? Because
it's a Gemara. It's a Gemara in Tainas Daf Chavav.
Okay.
Look at Rashi.
All right.
Mishnah.
So nagu means they just did it that way. They were machmir ka Rabbi Meir.
Right. And so we don't stop them, but we don't rule that way.
Okay. Thank you.
There were 5 groups of people that rented a big villa. They're together for Shabbos in a particular place, and they're living together. And now we need to know: do they need to have an eruv separately or not? So there's going to be various versions here on what is the separation between them in order to know whether they need an eruv. The fact that they're in one structure, even though that they have separate entrances, but since they're in one house, that whether that counts as one or not. So Beishamai eruv l'chol chabura v'chabura. Beishamai say that these are separate entities, and each one of them needs to put a separate bread into the communal eruv, because it counts as if they're 5 separate houses, and therefore, even amongst themselves, if they want to carry within one space that one is living in to the other's space, they would need an eruv amongst themselves. And Basil say, no, you don't need an eruv for each one of them because they're living in one house. That's considered a single entity, and therefore they're going to count as a single space. And one person on behalf of the group can make an eruv for everyone, and they can put a bread in, and that would count for everyone. And amongst themselves, also, they don't need an eruv; they can carry from one to the other. So when the one person puts an eruv in, he's representative of the whole group. But if they're actually living in separate units, where each one of them has their own their own room, and each one has, or one is someone living upstairs and someone downstairs. That would count as separate entities for sure, and they would have to have their own eruvs. So that everybody agrees. But when they're living in a space that is one space, but it's divided in some way. So there, Beis Shammai say that the dividers makes it that each one is a separate entity, and they need an eruv in order to carry from each other, and therefore each one has to give their own bread into the communal bread basket for the eruv of that courtyard. And Beis Shammai say no, they still count as a single entity. They don't need an eruv between each other, and therefore one person putting the bread into the communal bread box is going to count for everybody participating in the eruv. Amar Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman now in this first version is going to explain that the machlokes is b'mesipas, that all they had between their space in this house that they rented together, that they're in this place, is mesipas, which is a small wood barrier between each one of them. Avo mechitza asara, but if they have at least a 10 tefach wall between each space, that's going to be sufficient to say, you know what, each one is a separate entity, and even Beis Hillel are going to say you need each one counts as a separate entity. Each one has to put their bread in to the communal eruv together, and they have to make an eruv amongst each other in order to carry within that house. Everybody will agree that they're separate entities, and each group needs their own eruv. However, there are those that say Amar Nachman af b'mesipas machlokas. What he means is that even in a small piece of wood is a machlokas. That Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagree in a 10 tefach wall as well. Then where Beis Shammai say that it's separate and Beis Hillel say that they're a single entity. The meaning that Rav Nachman had was that even if it's a low wall, a small wall that's less than 10 tefachim, less than 30 inches or so, nevertheless, they're going to say, look, there's a divider. You have any form of divider between the groups, that's sufficient to say you're separate entities. And according to Beis Shammai, they need an eruv to carry amongst each other, and each one separately has to participate in the communal bread.
So quick question. What if the front, I'm assuming this looks like a front yard. So if they have some kind of a wall separating the units in the front yard, but they have a shared backyard, then what?
So here the wall is not in the yard itself. The yard we assume is open and in the front and the back. I mean, the chutzner is a shared opening. Well, I don't know about the back. The front, the chutzner that we're joining in is all shared space. It's a front yard that's shared. Inside the home, there are dividers. That's what's going on. It's one large room with dividers between each group. And therefore, Beis Shammai say they're separate entities. And Beis Hillel say, no, it's in a large room. They're in one space, and therefore that counts as one entity, even though that within that space, there are delineated areas for each group.
I'm imagining the difference between a motel and a lodge. A motel, there's separate rooms. Everybody's got walls. They're completely separate. And but in a lodge, it's like one large common space.
Sure. I mean, I don't know specifically what you mean by a lodge, but yeah, if you have a large sleeping area, but everybody has their own delineated space, and we'll see what that delineation needs to be in order for it to count as a totally separate space or not.
A bunch of people get together and they do a Airbnb and they rent a 15-room house.
But there, the rooms are separate, right? That's still going to be a separate room. We're talking about where their space is in one large area, but they have it delineated with,
right.
Yeah, maybe you have some dividers between each table so people have privacy when they eat, but it's really a joint area.
Right.
So if it's less than 10 tefachim, it is mesipas. And the second version says that no, even mesipas. So everybody, so the machlokas is both if it's a 10 tefachim wall, which is about 30 so inches, or even mesipas, even less, that's enough of a divider according to Beis Shammai. And Beis Hillel say even if it's 10 tefachim, it's not going to be enough of a divider. However, Ikeda Amri, so Pligi bar Rav Chia v'Rab Shimon bar Rebbe. There's another two versions of where this machlokas is about. Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rebbe, disagree. One says, no, we're talking about even the machlokas is where the barriers get all the way up to the top of the wall, the top to the ceiling. However, as Tosfos explains, but they are curtains as opposed to solid walls. So there's a curtain all the way up to the top. Everybody has their own space. Think like a hospital curtain which divides two beds in a room maybe, where you can just pull it open and close it, but each one has their own space by this curtain. But it really is just it's really just one large room. So even there. Beis Shammai are going to say it counts as one entity, and Beis Hillel say no, they're individual. Beis Shammai say they're individual units. But if the walls don't get to the ceiling, then everybody would agree. Even Beis Shammai say that's one large entity. And one eruv is going to count for everybody. However, the other one said, no, the machlokas is when the walls don't get to the ceiling, even above 10 tefachim, but they don't get to the ceiling. But if they do get to the ceiling, even Beis Hillel are going to agree that counts as a separate entity, even though it's curtain. But it's a separate entity because it gets to the ceiling. Everybody would say you need an eruv for each group. So now we turn to Ayin Beis Amud Beis. Mesa Beis, we ask a question. Rabbi Yehuda Sabar. Rabbi Yehuda Sabar said exactly what the word Sabar means of various interpretations. Rashi says he was called that on account of how sharp and clear-minded he was. So, Rabbi Yehuda Sabar, no, if the walls get all the way to the ceiling, temporary walls or not, everybody will agree. You have a separate door and a separate space with a wall or a curtain going up to the ceiling. Everybody's going to agree that counts as a separate space. So where did Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagree whether they count as a single entity or separate entities? It's in a house where you have dividers between the groups, but those dividers don't go up to the ceiling. Beis Shammai say each one has its own entrance and they have a delineated space with a divider. That means each one accounts as a separate entity. They need their own eruv and they need an eruv to carry between amongst themselves. And Beis Hillel say no, you need an eruv. One eruv for everybody because they count as a single entity. They don't need an eruv to carry amongst each other. So if one puts in an eruv to the communal courtyard eruv, they are acting on behalf of the whole group. Now the Gemara brings this brisa from Rabbi Yehuda Sabar and challenges the two versions of Rab Nachman and the machlokas between Rabbi Shimon ben Rebbe and Rabbi Chia. So according to the version that said that even if the walls get all the way up to the ceiling, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are going to disagree, and Beis Hillel is still going to say that it counts as a single entity. Well, that's to Yufta. That's going to be contradicted from this brisa. And according to the version that said that no, it's talking about that there are dividers, but the dividers don't get all the way up to the ceiling. That's where there's a disagreement between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Siyata, that they're supported by this brisa. And according to the version that said that the machlokas of Rabbi, the version of Rav Nachman, the first version, that said that only when there are these low dividers, this less than 10 tefachim high, less than 30 inches, that's where Beis Shammai say that they count as, the Beis Hillel say they count as individual, one unit. But if there are 10 tefachim high walls, then they no longer count as a single entity, even according to Beis Hillel. To Yufta, that's contradicted here as well, because the only distinction Rabbi Yehuda Sabar made was if it doesn't reach the ceiling. But of course, 10 tefachim high is not going to be make a difference. Lahach lishna the Amar Nachman af b'mesipas machlekas. However, according to the version, the second version of Rav Nachman, that said, not only is there a disagreement when there is a 10 tefachim wall, but even when there's this low wall, it's just simply like a demarcation, but it really is not a mechitza, it's not a barrier between the two. Even there, Beis Shammai are going to say they count as separate entities. Well, should we say that this is also a contradiction? Rav Nachman says no. Perhaps that Rabbi Yehuda Sabar means that any barrier is going to be enough for Beis Shammai to consider it separate. Not only if it doesn't reach the ceiling, but it's above 10 tefachim, but even if it's below 10 tefachim, as long as there's something between the two and between the multiple entities, that's going to count as separate entities according to Beis Shammai. So why did he say specifically the term mechitza, a barrier that's halachically usually above 10 tefachim? To tell you the strength of Beis Hillel, that even if you have a halachic mechitza, 10 tefachim high, nevertheless, it's going to count as a single entity since it doesn't reach the ceiling, and that tells you the strength of Beis Hillel. So why didn't we tell you the strength of Beis Shammai, that they are strict and count them separate and independent entities, even though that it only has a tiny demarcation and not a wall, which would tell you the strength of Beis Shammai's opinion. To tell you the strength of the leniency is always stronger. And even though usually we don't say that for a rabbinic matter, and this is obviously midrabanan, but nevertheless, because it's Beis Hillel, we wanted to tell you the leniency and the strength of the leniency of Beis Hillel. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Halacha Rabbi Yehuda Sabar. So Rav Nachman said in the name of Rav, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda Sabar, that these dividers, if they reach all the way to the top, to the ceiling, even if it's a curtain according to Tosfos, it's going to be enough of a divider, and each one is going to count as a separate entity. But if not, then we're going to follow Beis Hillel and say that they count as a single unit, a single entity, and one person making the Eruv on behalf of everyone would count, and they don't need an Eruv amongst themselves.
Can we go back for just 1 second? I want to ask something.
Sure.
I've heard it say, you just said something about Psaka. I've heard it said about certain poskim that their strength was that they found heterium on things that other people wouldn't take on.
Yeah.
That the koyach of it sounded like you were saying that that doesn't apply to halacha, but I've heard it said by
What do you mean? What do you mean that it doesn't apply?
But Yaakov Kamenetsky, they talked about the fact that he found heterium, the things that he himself was strict about, that he found heterium for other people that they could do it.
Yeah, but what do you mean I said that doesn't apply? I'm not sure.
That's what I'm trying to understand. What you said about practical law doesn't apply in practical halacha. I didn't understand what you said at the end of the discussion of hetera adif. I didn't understand what you said.
The Gemara is asking why the explanation that we gave wasn't particularly about it was particularly about the wall that is at least 10 tefachim high, which is called mechitza, which tells you the leniency of Beis Hillel, that even if it has a halachic mechitza, nevertheless, we're going to count it as a single entity space. And that tells us the strength of Beis Hillel's leniency. Why didn't we tell us that? Why didn't Rabbi Yehuda Sabar tell us a scenario where it's just a small ledge between them, less than 10 tefachim, and that would tell you the strength of the stringency of Beis Shammai, that they are strict and count them as separate entities, even if they are the wall between them is less than 10 tefachim. So the Gemara says, no, the Brisa is interested in telling us the power of the leniency of Beis Hillel, that how lenient they are, that even if the wall is almost up to the ceiling, it's still they're going to count it as a single entity. And this is the concept of koyach da'atera adif. The Brisa, the Gemara would always like to teach us the power of the leniency more than the power of the one who's being strict. And I said to that, usually that's in a Torah manner, because in a rabbinic manner, in the Derabanan, we're lenient on matters of doubt quite often. So that's not so strong that that's not a strength in the argument, saying, look, he clearly understands this to be lenient because he's taking the opinion that he can be lenient. Because in rabbinic matters, even in matters of doubt, sometimes we're lenient. So therefore, we usually don't use this logic that why the Brisa chose this scenario that shows the leniency in a matter of Derabanan. But nevertheless, here in this case, Rabbi Yehuda Saber explained the scenario according to Beis Hillel, showing the leniency of Beis Hillel, that even if there's a complete barrier between the various entities, as long as the barrier doesn't reach the ceiling, they're going to count as separate entities. Gemara further is going to elaborate on the concept of these the separate entities versus one entity in this lodge, as you call it, that they are all joined in together, but have some barriers between them. We know we spoke about this before, that the concept of an eruv is everybody puts the bread together into a basket and they bring it into one home in the courtyard. And now essentially everybody's living in that one home because they all have their meal there. They happen to be sleeping somewhere else, but the very fact that they have their meal in this home makes it a unified place that they're all living in a joint space. And that counts as a single unit in the courtyard. Now, in our scenario, the Gemara is going to now deal with this bread basket that has everybody's meals in it. Is it in someone else's home in the courtyard, or is it in this lodge, in this joint space? Sorry. So first we said that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda Saber. So Amar Nachman Yitzchak Maslizna Nami Deka. Our Mishnah also shows that way. The Ketani Modim is man shemiktsasam shurim bechadarim ubalias, because it says they agree to each other if some are living in rooms or in a second floor above. Which tells you that they would need an eruv for each one separately. What are upper floors and rooms? Are we talking about actual separate rooms? Of course, why would they be a single entity? They each one have their own house, their own room. Are we talking about that they're in a separate floor? Of course, they're going to count pshita. Of course, that's going to count as separate entities. Why would they count as one? It means like rooms, like separate rooms. It's these, as Tosfos explains, these curtains that reach to the ceiling, and there they agree. So we see that they agree if the curtains reach the ceiling, but if there's a barrier that does not reach the ceiling, that doesn't count as a separate room, and that's where Beis Shammai are still strict and count them separate, and Beis Hillel are lenient. So Tana we learn. When is this true? That they count as separate entities and they're going to need a separate eruv, or they count as one? When that their eruv is actually in a separate house. So therefore, Beis Shammai say, since the eruv is not in this lodge, so therefore everybody has to participate separately. Aval, but if the eruv would actually come and be brought into the lodge where they're staying, everybody agrees that counts as a single entity, and they don't have to make a separate eruv amongst themselves. So the reasoning of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel over here is going to be based not on the barriers between them that we understood up until now. But this Bryce is going to be dealing with. Everybody would agree. This opinion now says no. It's not. It's not based on the barriers. Everybody would agree that the lodge, this place that they're staying, counts as a single entity because they're staying within one space. And however, this goes back to another discussion that we had, which is when 5 people live in one courtyard and they made a single Eruv together. And now one person representing them goes ahead and takes a bread, not from their joint basket, but takes a bread separately and brings it over to another chutzner and says, hey, let's join, and our courtyard and your courtyard can carry to each other. So this representative, can they represent everybody or not? Or do we say, no, every member of this courtyard is going to have to join in and put a bread into the other courtyard? That's what the machlokas says over here. And so Beis Shammai are of the opinion that since the house counts as one single entity because it's as if they have a joint Eruv. Now, they don't have to make an Eruv amongst themselves. So when one person takes a bread and puts it into an Eruv of the communal Eruv, they're taking like from one courtyard and bringing it and joining in with another courtyard. There, each one, according to Beis Shammai, is going to have to bring their own bread. And Beis Hillel is saying, no, one bread can represent this courtyard joining with the other. However, if they're bringing their breads into our courtyard, we don't each have to participate because we're already an entity together as one. So therefore it says, everybody is going to count as joint already, and they're joining into our courtyard. It's a separate courtyard, the outer courtyard, joining into our inner courtyard, the inside of the lodge, and it's going to count as, and you don't need a separate Eruv for each one. So now the Gemara asks, what about this brisa? Whose opinion is this? 5 people gather an Eruv together in their courtyard. Now when they want to make their Eruv and join with another space, one is going to be sufficient if one person brings a bread on behalf of this group, this entity, and they join with another entity. That must be the opinion of Beis Hillel, which we just saw. There are those that say, some say it's the contrary. Everybody agree, the machlokas is only when others bring the Eruv to our court, to the lodge, to our joint space. But if we're bringing our Eruv to another space, that there everybody's going to agree that each individual group is going to have to bring their Eruv separately. And this is based on the Beis Shammai hold that even when you're in your own space, each one counts individually, and everybody has to participate in the joint Eruv. Well, then whose brisa is this that says 5 people who gather Eruv that when they bring the Eruv to the next neighbor, to the next courtyard, it's sufficient for one bread to be brought over? According to that version, it wouldn't be according to Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai. In other words, that the first version of Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel says, and Beis Shammai, that when one courtyard of 5 and another courtyard of 5 want to join Eruvs, one person can bring the Eruv to the other. That's Beis Hillel. And in the second version, no, even when they bring their Eruv over to us, each one of us is still going to have to join, according to Beis Shammai. And Beis Hillel say, no, we don't have to. But the ones that are bringing the Eruv, the other courtyard bringing the Eruv, each one of those 5 would have to join in.